It looks as though the United Nations has given up on world governments to save us from the climate emergency. Instead, it's come up with a much more direct, much more subversive plan. It looks as though it wants the world banks to take the lead. If you want to do anything in the global economy, it takes money. The banks are in a position to do a lot of harm or a lot of good. If you can get the banks to act, everyone else will have to follow along, whether they like it or not. So, in this video, I'm going to look at how the United Nations is trying to organise the banks, how that's working, and if they're doing enough. Which is a silly question really, isn't it? Because we all know nobody is doing enough to save the world from the climate emergency. But let's pretend we don't know and see how it goes in the video. In this protest, Extinction Rebellion London are nominating HSBC to be Climate Criminal of the Year 2022.
To such an extent that shareholders are being denied this opportunity. As chair of this meeting, my duty is to ensure the business is properly conducted and that order is maintained.
This protest is much less inclusive than your normal one. Just to get into the hall, you had to either be an HSBC shareholder or nominated as a proxy. It looks as though they were expecting something because security is so tight you had to go through metal detectors. It's on a weekday. And if you wanted to be doing the singing, you had to practice your singing and rehearse with the others. But it's an excellent example of non-violent direct action because it's quite disruptive, but all that's happening is people are singing. So it's not illegal to sing, it is disruptive. I think the CEO of HSBC, who is the chairperson at the meeting, I think he does quite a good job. He must be under stress and frustrated that the meeting can't go ahead, but he sort of faces up to it with good grace, gives the protesters a chance to stop singing. Remember, it's a legal requirement to have a shareholder meeting, so once your shareholders are there, you can't just throw them out, you have to give them a chance to calm down a bit. In the end, he does throw them out. Now, quite often protests are aimed at getting their issue into the media, getting it reported. This sort of protest is much more direct. The board of HSBC are right there on the stage. The meeting is being live streamed all the way around the world to their shareholders who can't get there in person. Even when the protest starts, they carry on live streaming because it's a legal requirement to have a meeting for their shareholders. Remember, this is HSBC, the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation. What do you think they make about the protest in China? At this protest, I was on the inside live streaming with another live streamer, and there's other live streamers on the outside. At the Shell annual meeting, shareholders annual meeting, I was at the outside live streaming for 4 hours in a row. There were other people inside live streaming, but it gave me a chance to interview the people as they came out and to explain what it's like to take part in a protest which involves singing at a shareholders meeting. Now, I didn't have the camera lined up properly, but you'll just have to make do with that. Here's someone explaining what it's like to stand up and be the first person who starts the singing in the hall.
I always say this, it needs no introduction, he's the expert singer, which inside must be quite a useful skill. So tell us what happened inside, especially like the singing part of it and your role in that.
Yeah, happy to. Hello everyone. This close is good. So I just came out a few minutes ago from the Shell AGM here, and it was very, very exciting. My heart was beating like mad before we first started. I was actually the first one to disrupt, so I took the tempo and my friend gave me the note, and then we started singing. I started singing by myself the verse for this reworded version of Queen's "We Will Rock You" to sing "We Will Stop You." Everyone knew it, and it was very powerful. So we joined in. At first it was just a couple of us singing, but then the whole group stood up and did the stomp, stomp, clap, stomp, stomp, clap. It felt, the acoustics were really great in there, so it felt like the whole room was singing, basically. And initially we expected to sing it 3 times around, and then probably just get escorted out with the security, having a problem with us being there, but that didn't happen, so I was like, let's keep going, and another one! And so we sang it about 5 times through, just to make sure, to be nice and disruptive, but to also give the amazing people that had prepared speeches a chance. So that's what happened next. We finished the song, sat down, and we're really surprised to see that no one was dragged about and manhandled and nothing.
That no one was manhandled by security guards is an important part of non-violent protest. It might all seem chaotic and anarchic, but there are unspoken rules. The protesters, the police and security guards all know them, and so far at least follow them. After 4 years of protest, as far as I'm aware, no police officer has ever been injured at an XR protest. The security guards let the police deal with the protesters. If a member of the public tries to stop a protest, for example, by dragging someone off the road, the police will arrest them. Violence is still considered an ugly thing. At the HSBC AGM, the security guard sees the other person live streaming, but he doesn't try and snatch her phone off her or drag her out. He puts his arm around her and gently guides her towards the door. In the video, it's not completely obvious just how close you are to the board of directors. Some people, during the protest, with all the singing and chaos going on, were even able to go up to the stage and try and engage in a constructive conversation with the directors.
I couldn't tell my son yesterday why I was coming here. It was just too heartbreaking. Yeah.
Don't make me cry as well.
Sorry.
So, how old is your son?
He's 8.
8 years old.
Yeah, and he's just, he's so bright and chirping. He loves wildlife, and just knowing it's all being decimated. Yeah, it's just made me so distraught. So I actually went and I had a conversation with the chairman. I went right up to the front and I spoke to all of them directly and tried to look them in the eye and appeal to them. And yeah, they've got children too. Yeah, we're all in this, and we've got to take everyone with us. Yeah, so I don't know what impact it's had.
So that's really interesting. You actually walked up to the front of the stage with all this chaos going on, and the CEO was there, and he was able to hear what you were saying.
Yeah, I had a conversation with him.
Okay. So tell us what you said to him and what he said back to you.
Well, I tried to connect with him because I felt that sort of just shouting at him he wasn't going to listen. So I tried to tell him. I asked him to think about his children, his grandchildren, for all of them, and also I don't know if they've read it, but in the latest IPCC report on chapter 9 on Africa, hidden on page 148, it's saying that maybe by 2030 up to 700 million people will be displaced as a result of water shortages, and it's just absolutely, it's so insane. I can't believe it.
And this is a good thing about non-violent direct action, especially if you have a reputation for being non-violent and approachable. People who you're protesting against will come and talk to you. It's easy to say this bank and that bank, but these banks are all full of thousands of people, different opinions. Some people do want to do more. Here's an example of a protest outside Vanguard, which I think is an American big financial institution. It handles other people's money. And somebody from inside the bank did talk to one of the protesters. Have you had any interaction with people going in and out or anything like that?
I have, yes. I met someone who claimed to be a consultant with them today, very sympathetic. I met someone who worked in their social fund, trying to, where clearly which is only 1.5% of all their funds, so it's tiny. But they are thinking about wider considerations that will lead them to different kinds of investments.
So that really is interesting. You've met someone who does they have a social fund at Vanguard.
Yes.
So tell us, well, this is groundbreaking news. This is a bombshell. What are Vanguard planning to do with their social fund?
Well, it exists, and its social fund does have a far more thoughtful set of investment criteria, but it's tiny. It's only 1.5% of their assets, and so it is insignificant compared to the terrible harm that they're doing with the 98 point.
And here's another example. Here's a protest outside Standard Chartered Bank, and Bill Winters, who's the chief executive officer for the bank, came down when he saw the protest and spoke to the protesters. And it's not just HSBC or Standard Chartered or Vanguard. Barclays is another big investor in fossil fuels, so they get their fair share of protests. Anyway, back to the United Nations. They've set up what's called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And it's made up of over 500 of the world's biggest banks and financial institutions. And this is its objectives: to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest, to support the global ambition to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And to do that, the members set interim science-based targets for 2025 or 2030, reflecting maximum effort towards a fair share of the 50% global reduction in greenhouse emissions needed by 2030. Straight away, the alliance is more ambitious than world governments. The world governments, or most of them, say they want to try and be carbon neutral by 2050. None of them, as far as I'm aware, have any significant targets by 2030 or 2025. And those targets are what scientists say we need to achieve to try and keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So it sounds positive. And how is it going to do that? By peer group pressure. Stakeholders will be able to track corporate and financial institutions' climate progress, including gaps between their metrics and targets. Stakeholders can assess the extent to which that gap is due to the institution itself or factors beyond the institution's control, such as its legal or regulatory environment or inadequate country climate policies. So it's a way of showing up governments. If the government has inadequate country climate policies, it's going to be very, very, very obvious. They're going head to head with the world's governments, and they're using the big banks to do it. And you might think, well, how can a bank do that? Because say you work for HSBC Bank, which we're going to use as an example. We work for HSBC Bank. I sit at my desk waiting for applications to arrive. I'm a bit limited. If the world economy doesn't want to invest in green things, what can I do? Well, they've thought of that. And the Alliance is advised by 17 different think tanks. And here's some advice it's getting from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. Many banks regard themselves as client-led. These bankers were more comfortable taking a passive approach that responds to client demand. The key characteristics of a bank enabling its clients to transition to a low-carbon economy is an active mindset, one that prioritises relationships over transactions and which is underpinned by a forward-looking attitude that sees a low-carbon future as inevitable. So there'll be no banking on a dead planet. They've got to get on with it. They may as well do it sooner rather than later. One thing I have a concern about is the UN says the alliance is science-based, but its advisors aren't scientists. There are 17 different think tanks that it's taking advice from. They're not science groups. They're groups that may have had experience of sustainable investing and those sorts of things. They all sound very positive. They say things like, yes, we can certainly save the world and we can have economic growth, and they've got lots of pictures and graphs of lines going up and everyone looking happy. The thing that surprises me, there are so many of these groups and they're so well funded. You know, they have such expensive websites and they employ so many hundreds of people, some of them. It's all a bit, I don't really understand it myself. And one of the reasons I have a concern is because the whole world is basing all its efforts on the Paris 2015 climate agreement, and that says we must aim to try and keep temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius and way below an increase of 2 degrees Celsius. Well, the International Energy Agency took that away and decided well below 2 degrees Celsius really meant a 66% chance of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. And then the International Energy Agency came along with its plan, which I featured in a previous video, and their plan involved things like carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, modern bioenergy, and as you saw in the video, none of those can realistically be produced at scale quickly enough to have the biggest effect. In fact, it's far from clear whether they'll work at all. So at every level it gets a bit weakened. You know, the objectives aren't what they were meant to be. The way of achieving the objectives aren't really feasible, it seems to me. And then these 17 think tanks produce some glossy websites and say something positive and try to sound like there's still chance. And then the banks get involved. Well, they're meant to, if you remember what they're committed to, what was it? They said maximum effort. As we'll see in a minute, it's far from clear that they're doing their maximum effort. And then on top of that, you have the world's economy, which needs money from the banking sector. Well, we'll see later on, are things getting better or worse, but it sounds very good. Well, if that's not going to work, it's far from clear if this is going to work. But there is something positive that could come out of it if you could take away what's called the social license away from the big oil companies. The big oil companies, they need support services, they need to borrow money, they need to recruit staff, especially graduates, people starting off in their careers. They can choose to work in any sector of industry, they don't have to work for the big oil companies. If they become reviled as like outcasts, then even though they might legally be able to operate, everything becomes very difficult. We're going to use HSBC as an example of how the finance sector is changing. I could have chosen any bank. And we're going to see the effect of things like protests and its membership of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero are changing things. The Sing protest happened in April 2022, and there had been a previous protest the year before when some brave XR people broke the windows at its headquarters in Canary Wharf, which is where we are now. We'll make April 2022 our starting point. Well, in May 2022, HSBC's head of responsible investing gave a speech where he was complaining about all the fuss people making about climate change, and in the speech he said unsubstantiated, shrill, partisan, self-serving, apocalyptic warnings are always wrong. He wasn't complaining about what Extinction Rebellion were doing, he was complaining about warnings from the Bank of England and the United Nations. Anyway, he had to leave the business, but what's interesting is that speech had been signed off by the business before he made it. So at one time, possibly a month or two earlier, it was okay to say that. By May 2022, it was just politically impossible for anyone to say that the concerns about climate change were unsubstantiated. Then in September 2022, HSBC said it would no longer invest in thermal coal. Now, for the purposes of this video, there are 3 types of coal, and it's more important than you might think because it's quite complicated. There's thermal coal, which HSBC have said they won't invest in anymore. Thermal coal. There is metallurgical coal, which is used for coking, for producing steel, and those two types of coal are both bituminous. And then there is lignite or brown coal. So remember that for the future in a minute in the video. And then in October 2022, some of HSBC's ads where they tried to portray themselves as being green were banned, and they were banned by the Advertising Standards Agency, which is the regulator of adverts in Britain. This is what the agency said despite the initiatives highlighted in the ads, HSBC was continuing to significantly finance investments in businesses and industries that emitted notable levels of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. We did not consider consumers would know that was the case. We concluded that the ads omitted material information and they were therefore misleading. So at one time, I can imagine the advertising regulator would have said, well, it's legally correct, there's nothing we can do. Now, people in the country, in the Advertising Standards Agency at least, are becoming more aware of the overall picture, and it's becoming more difficult for HSBC to operate. In some ways, the bank is almost losing its social license itself, isn't it? Then, in December 2022, HSBC made a big announcement. They said they would no longer provide new lending or capital markets finance for the specific purpose of projects pertaining to new oil and gas fields. Well, straight away, this is good because it's consistent of what the United Nations and the scientists are saying, that if we're to have a survivable future, we must not develop any new oil or gas fields. And this is an example where a business, which is part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is setting higher standards than the British government. At the moment, the British government wants to give new licenses to exploit new oil and gas fields in the North Sea is having trouble getting people to lend, so it's actually having to encourage them. Can you imagine that? Normally the big banks, big oil, money for nothing almost, isn't it? That is changing. So the United Nations, Extinction Rebellion, other protest groups, including activist shareholders, activist investors, things are starting to change. The HSBC said they would continue to lend to the oil companies, but only in line with business as usual, and that understanding that oil and gas is still needed, but is going to be into decline, but no new investments, which is good. Then they said they would also prohibit finance for new metallurgical coal mines, so the coal mines that are used to produce coking coal for steel production. And again, this is something where HSBC is going further than the British government. The British government recently gave planning permission for a new coal mine in Cumbria to go ahead, which is going to produce metallurgical coal. Now, it's been in the news in Germany. There's a massive open cast coal mine being produced. Greta Thunberg was arrested there, and HSBC has lent money for that coal mine, but that's producing lignite coal or brown coal. Now, I do not know why that's better and why they're still prepared to lend to that coal mine and not to the other types of coal, but whatever the reasons, HSBC is at least being consistent with what it said it would do. Although people are questioning why it's doing it secretly, possibly because it doesn't want to lose more of its social license. Well, this is all very well, but my question is, are the big banks responsible for the world economy, and are they responsible for doing so much damage that means we will no longer have a sustainable future and therefore can be crowned the climate criminals of the year? Well, I don't think they can, but it's not quite that straightforward. Superficially, things are getting better. More money is being lent to sustainable projects. It's not enough. And also, I don't think we can condemn HSBC or Barclays, which is another big investor in fossil fuels, because although Barclays and HSBC are the biggest investor in fossil fuels in Europe, the American banks are really much more heavily involved in fossil fuels. While HSBC and Barclays, they do seem to be trying to implement the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero's objectives. Maybe they're not doing it as quickly as they need to, or they could do, but the American banks are doing much less. They're much more heavily invested in fossil fuels, and it looks as though some of the American banks will leave the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, including JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America and Morgan Stanley, and they're using the excuse or the reason that it might come against US antitrust laws. Do you believe that? Surely banks are free to invest their money wherever they think best. This is quite a good summary of how the world's getting on altogether. There's made some progress. The protesters, the United Nations, HSBC can all say things are getting better and we've done something good and feel proud of what we've done. But it's not enough, is it? It's certainly not if we go back to the very beginning. The objectives were, what was it? Maximum effort towards a fair share of 50% global reduction in greenhouse gases. And they do that by being proactive and relying on relationships and not just transactions. Is that happening? No. Another reason we can't blame the banks is because during this story, from time to time, a real villain has appeared. The villain that the United Nations is going up against, who still wants to extract new oil and gas reserves from the North Sea, even though the science and the United Nations says this is a very dangerous thing to do. Who are still granting licenses for coal mines that the banks will no longer give the license to. It's the government. And in future videos, we'll just see how sneaky they're being in trying to avoid tackling climate change.